From South Bend tonight, the end of an era. Studebaker has shut down its last American factory, bringing it close to more than a century of car making in this city. Out on the streets, workers file past the gates, lunch pails in hand, their future...
From the heyday of the American automobile, another chapter closes. Here in South Bend, the lights are going out at Studebaker's last U.S. plant, shuttered in...
Studebaker just shut down its last American factory in 1963. Packard, the luxury brand that once rivaled Cadillac, well, it disappeared entirely by 1958. American Motors, the scrappy independent that somehow survived the 1960s, was hemorrhaging money by the late 1970s. And Kaiser-Frazer? Well, they didn't even make it past 1955. Now, this isn't just a story about a few companies going bankrupt. This is an extinction event. By 1980, the American automotive landscape had been completely transformed. The independents, the scrappy underdogs that once represented nearly 25% of the American car market, well, they were absolutely annihilated. The big three, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, they didn't just win. They eliminated the competition entirely. So buckle up, because in today's video, we're diving deep into the collapse of America's independent automakers. We're talking about billion-dollar companies that simply vanished, engineering innovations that died with their creators, and the ruthless business practices that turned the American auto industry into an oligopoly that still controls the market today. But before we dive into this automotive graveyard, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next video where we expose how the big three use dirty tactics to destroy their competition. Trust me, you'll want to know. Now let's plunge straight in. So let's set the stage, because the collapse of the independents didn't happen overnight. It was a slow-motion train wreck that took nearly 3 decades. See, in 1950, America had 8 major automobile manufacturers. You had the big three, obviously, but you also had Studebaker, Packard, Nash, Hudson, and Kaiser-Frazer. These independents combined controlled about 18% of the American market. That's nearly 1 in 5 cars sold. But here's the thing. The independents were already vulnerable. They didn't have the economies of scale that the big three enjoyed. General Motors could spread development costs across Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac. Ford had Ford, Mercury, and Lincoln. Chrysler had Plymouth, Dodge, DeSoto, and Chrysler. But Studebaker? Well, they were just Studebaker. Nash was just Nash. And that structural disadvantage, well, it was a death sentence waiting to happen. Now, the 1950s started with hope. The post-war boom was in full swing. Americans were buying cars at record rates. But the independents made a catastrophic mistake. They competed on styling and features instead of price. And when the big three launched their own compact cars and aggressive pricing strategies, well, the independents couldn't respond fast enough. Let's start with the first domino to fall, Kaiser-Frazer. Now, Henry Kaiser was an industrialist who built ships during World War II. He thought he could revolutionize the car industry with modern designs and innovative features. The 1947 Kaiser was actually a beautiful car. It had advanced styling, a spacious interior, and it sold reasonably well in its first few years. But Kaiser made 2 fatal mistakes. Mistake number 1, they didn't have their own engine. They bought engines from Continental Motors, which meant they had no cost advantage and no ability to innovate on powertrains. Mistake number 2, they underestimated how quickly the big three would respond. By 1949, Ford, GM, and Chrysler all launched completely redesigned models that made the Kaiser look outdated overnight. Sales collapsed. In 1950, Kaiser-Frazer sold 146,000 cars. By 1953, they sold just 32,000. The company tried merging with Willys Overland, the Jeep manufacturer, but it was too late. By 1955, Kaiser stopped building passenger cars entirely in the United States. They limped along building cars in Argentina and Brazil until the early 1960s, but in America, well, they were finished. The first independent was dead. Now let's talk about the merger that was supposed to save 2 companies, but instead just delayed their inevitable deaths. In 1954, Nash and Hudson merged to form American Motors Corporation. George Romney, the CEO, had a vision. He believed Americans wanted smaller, more economical cars, and you know what? He was actually right. The problem was timing and execution. The Nash Rambler and later the AMC Rambler were genuinely good cars. They were fuel efficient, practical, and for a brief moment in the late 1950s, AMC was actually profitable. They sold over 400,000 cars in 1960. Romney became a national figure. People talked about AMC as the David fighting the Goliath of the big three. But here's where it all went wrong. The big three noticed AMC's success with compact cars, and they responded with overwhelming force. In 1960, Ford launched the Falcon, Chevrolet launched the Corvair, Plymouth launched the Valiant, and suddenly, AMC wasn't competing against indifferent giants. They were competing against companies with 10 times their resources, massive dealer networks, and the ability to undercut AMC on price while still making profits on their larger vehicles. AMC's market share started declining. They tried fighting back with the Javelin muscle car and the Gremlin subcompact, but every time AMC innovated, the big three copied them and did it better with more resources. By the mid-1970s, AMC was surviving on Jeep sales after acquiring the brand in 1970. Their passenger cars were afterthoughts, and by 1979, they needed a bailout from Renault just to stay alive. The French company eventually absorbed AMC completely, another independent gone. But the most tragic story, well, that's Studebaker-Packard. Now, Studebaker had been building vehicles since 1852. Yes, you heard that right. They started as a wagon manufacturer before the automobile even existed. They survived the Great Depression. They survived World War II, but they couldn't survive the 1950s. Studebaker's cars were actually innovative. The 1953 Starliner, designed by Raymond Loewy, is still considered one of the most beautiful cars ever built. Their 1959 Lark Compact was ahead of its time. But beautiful designs don't matter when you're losing money on every car you build, and that's exactly what was happening. See, Studebaker had a problem. Their South Bend, Indiana factory was old and inefficient. Their labor costs were higher than the big three because they had negotiated generous union contracts during the good years, and their dealer network was collapsing. Dealers were closing because they couldn't make money selling Studebakers when customers could walk across the street and buy a Chevrolet with better resale value and more service locations. The Studebaker-Packard merger was a disaster. Packard's last true Packard was built in 1956. After that, they were just rebadged Packard nameplates. Insiders called them Packard Bakers, and customers saw right through the charade. Packard died in 1958, and Studebaker wasn't far behind. Studebaker closed its South Bend plant in December 1963. They continued building cars in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, until March 1966. But those final Studebakers were really just parts bin specials built from leftover inventory. When the last Studebaker rolled off the line in 1966, it marked the end of 114 years of vehicle manufacturing. An American institution absolutely gone. Now, let's talk about why this happened, because it wasn't just bad luck or poor management. The independents faced structural disadvantages that were essentially insurmountable. First, economies of scale. General Motors in 1955 built over 5 million vehicles. Studebaker built 116,000. When you're building 5 million vehicles, you can negotiate better prices on steel, rubber, glass, everything. You can invest billions in new factories and automation. You can spread development costs across multiple brands and models. Studebaker couldn't do any of that. Every car they built cost more to manufacture than a comparable GM or Ford product. They had to charge higher prices or accept lower profit margins. Either way, they lost. It's Economics 101 and it killed them. Second, dealer networks. General Motors had over 16,000 dealers in the 1950s. Studebaker had about 2,600 at their peak, and that number was shrinking every year. Dealers are the lifeblood of the car business. They provide sales, service, and parts. When customers couldn't find a Studebaker dealer nearby, they bought something else. And when dealers couldn't make money selling Studebakers, they switched to selling Fords or Chevrolets. It was a death spiral. Fewer sales meant less money to support dealers, less dealer support meant more dealers closing, and the cycle continued until there was nothing left. Third, the big three used predatory pricing. This is where it gets really ugly. See, Ford and GM could afford to sell certain models at break-even, or even at a loss because they made huge profits on their luxury brands and trucks. Studebaker couldn't do that. They had no luxury division printing money, so when Ford decided to undercut Studebaker on the compact car market, Studebaker had no response. They couldn't match Ford's prices without going bankrupt, and they couldn't maintain higher prices without losing customers. Some historians argue this was deliberate. The big three wanted the independents dead, and they used their financial power to make it happen. Whether it was intentional or just ruthless capitalism, well, the result was the independents died. Fourth, the independents couldn't keep up with model changes. In the 1950s, American car culture became obsessed with annual model changes. Every year, cars got longer, lower, wider, with more chrome and bigger fins. This was expensive. Designing and tooling for new models cost tens of millions of dollars. GM could afford it, Studebaker couldn't. So Studebaker and the other independents fell behind. Their designs started looking dated. Customers perceived them as old-fashioned, and in the image-conscious 1950s, that was a death sentence. Nobody wanted to be seen driving last year's design, especially if it was from a company that might not exist next year. And that brings us to the fifth factor, the perception of failure. Once customers started believing the independents might go bankrupt, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Why would you buy a Studebaker in 1960 if you thought the company might not be around in 1965 to provide parts and service? You wouldn't. You'd buy a Ford. And when enough customers made that decision, well, Studebaker actually did go bankrupt. The independents were trapped. They needed to invest billions to compete, but they couldn't raise that capital because investors didn't believe they could survive. Banks wouldn't lend to them. Stockholders sold their shares, and the companies slowly starved to death. Now, let's talk about the human cost because this wasn't just about corporate balance sheets. When Studebaker closed its South Bend plant in 1963, 7,000 workers lost their jobs overnight. These weren't just jobs. These were careers, generational employment where fathers and sons worked on the same assembly lines. South Bend's economy collapsed, unemployment spiked, families lost their homes, and the city didn't recover for decades. The same thing happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin when AMC declined. It happened in Detroit when Packard closed. Entire communities were devastated. And here's the really cruel part. Many of these workers had their pensions tied to their employers. When Studebaker went bankrupt, thousands of workers lost not just their jobs, but their retirement security. The Studebaker pension crisis became a national scandal that eventually led to federal pension protection laws, but that didn't help the workers who lost everything. The collapse of the independents also meant the loss of innovation. Studebaker pioneered disc brakes on American cars. They experimented with fiberglass bodies. Nash invented the modern heating and ventilation system. These companies were innovators, and when they died, that innovation died with them. The Big Three became complacent. Why innovate when you have no competition? By 1980, the transformation was complete. The American auto industry was controlled by three companies. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler built 97% of all cars sold in America. The independents were gone. Their factories were demolished or converted to other uses. Their brands existed only in the memories of older Americans and in the collections of classic car enthusiasts. But here's the death of the independents made the Big Three vulnerable to foreign competition. When Toyota and Honda entered the American market in the 1970s, they found an industry that had become fat, lazy, and complacent. The Big Three had spent so much energy destroying the independents that they didn't notice the real threat coming from overseas. The Japanese automakers did exactly what the independents tried to do. They built smaller, more efficient, more reliable cars. But unlike the independents, the Japanese had the backing of their government, access to cheap capital, and a long-term strategy that didn't require immediate profitability. By 1980, Japanese automakers controlled 21% of the American market. That's more than the independents ever controlled at their peak. The Big Three tried to respond, but they had forgotten how to compete. They had spent 30 years operating as an oligopoly, and suddenly they faced real competition again. Chrysler nearly went bankrupt in 1979 and needed a federal bailout. General Motors started losing billions. Ford struggled through the 1980s. The industry that destroyed the independents was now facing its own crisis. And you know what the real irony is? Some of the innovations that saved the Big Three in the 1980s and 1990s came from ideas the independents pioneered decades earlier. Compact cars, fuel efficiency, ergonomic design. These were all independent innovations that the Big Three initially mocked and then eventually copied when foreign competition forced their hand. So what's the lesson here? Well, it's complicated. On one hand, you could argue this was just capitalism working as intended. The most efficient companies survived. The weak ones died. That's how markets are supposed to work. But on the other hand, you could argue that the Big Three used anti-competitive practices to eliminate rivals, and that made the entire industry weaker in the long run. What we do know is that by 1980, an entire era of American automotive history was over. The independents, the companies that brought us some of the most beautiful and innovative cars ever built, were gone, and the American auto industry would never be the same. The factories are gone. The workers are gone. The brands are gone. All that's left are the cars themselves, rusting in barns and garages across America. Reminders of a time when the auto industry was more than just three massive corporations. They're reminders of when small companies could dream big, when innovation mattered more than market share, and when American manufacturing was about more than just the bottom line. So here's the bottom line. The collapse of the independents by 1980 wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific business decisions, structural disadvantages, and ruthless competition. Companies like Studebaker, Packard, and American Motors didn't fail because they couldn't compete against companies with 10 times their resources and no ethical boundaries about using that advantage. And today we're seeing history repeat itself. Small automakers and startups are trying to break into an industry dominated by massive global corporations. Some will succeed, most will fail, and 50 years from now, people will make videos about the electric vehicle startups that didn't survive 2085, just like we're talking about Studebaker today. The collapse isn't coming. It's been here before, and it'll be here again. So, which independent automaker do you think the Big Three deliberately destroyed their competition? Or was this just business? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell, because next week, we're diving into how the Big Three used political connections to block safety regulations that could have saved thousands of lives. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.